"Mr. Freeman," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow cutting through the entire church like a knife through silence. "I have a question that nobody has ever been able to answer." Morgan Freeman was visiting St. Mary's Community Church in a small town in Mississippi, invited to read scripture during their Sunday evening service. He often did this as part of his quiet charity work, bringing his legendary voice to small congregations who rarely saw celebrities. But this time, he didn't expect to be stopped by a 7-year-old girl right in the middle of the most sacred part of the service. The church was packed that evening, nearly 300 people filling every pew, drawn by the rare opportunity to hear the voice of God Himself read from the Bible. Morgan had just finished reading from Psalms when the little girl stood up in the front row, her tiny frame barely visible above the wooden pew. He smiled, thinking she might want an autograph or perhaps to tell him she'd seen one of his movies. "Sure, sweetheart," he said, his warm, familiar voice echoing through the hushed sanctuary. "What's on your mind?" Without hesitation, without fear, with the kind of innocent boldness that only children possess, she asked the question that would change everything in that church forever. "Where is God, Mr. Freeman? If He's everywhere like everyone says, then why can't I see Him? Why does it feel like He's hiding from me?" The silence that followed was deafening. You could hear a pin drop in that massive church. Morgan Freeman, the man who had literally played God on the big screen, the narrator who had guided millions through documentaries about faith and the universe, stood there completely speechless. This was not what he expected from a child. This was not a simple question about movies or fame. This was the question that philosophers, theologians, and believers had wrestled with for thousands of years, coming from the lips of someone who couldn't even reach the church podium. But what happened next would leave the entire congregation in tears, change the little girl's life forever, and reveal something about faith that none of them had ever considered before. Morgan Freeman's answer didn't just silence the church, it awakened something in every single person sitting in those pews that day. Something that had been sleeping in their hearts for far too long. The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about faith, about God, about finding meaning in a world that often felt empty and uncertain. And Morgan Freeman, standing there under the stained glass windows with hundreds of eyes watching his every move, realized that this moment would either be the most profound of his life or the most devastating mistake he'd ever made in front of a congregation. He looked down at the little girl's expectant face, then out at the sea of people waiting for his response, and took a breath that would change everything. Because what he was about to reveal wasn't just an answer, it was a truth so powerful that it would leave grown men crying and transform how everyone in that church understood their relationship with the divine forever. If this story is already giving you chills, hit that like button and subscribe because what Morgan Freeman said next will absolutely blow your mind. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever asked a question that changed everything? Because this little girl's courage to ask the impossible question is about to reveal something that will change how you see faith forever. Morgan looked around at the congregation, his eyes scanning the hundreds of faces staring back at him with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. Then he looked down at the little girl's innocent face, her brown eyes wide with genuine wonder, waiting for an answer that could either crush her spirit or ignite something beautiful in her heart. How could such a small child ask the question that had kept theologians awake at night for centuries? But there was no turning back now. With every person in that sacred space holding their breath, with parents nervously shifting in their seats wondering what their children might ask next, he had to answer. This wasn't just any church, and this wasn't just any moment. St. Mary's had been struggling for months. People were losing faith, attendance was dropping, and many members had confessed to Pastor Williams that they felt disconnected from God, that their prayers seemed to disappear into an empty sky. The weight of their collective doubt hung heavy in the air like morning fog, and now this child had voiced what everyone was thinking but was too afraid to say out loud. Morgan thought for a moment, his mind racing through decades of playing complex characters, narrating profound documentaries about the universe and human existence, even portraying the Almighty himself in movies. But never had he faced a question like this from a child in front of an entire congregation whose faith was already hanging by a thread. He had always been comfortable discussing philosophy and spirituality in interviews and documentaries, but this was different. This was raw, real, and terrifyingly honest. The silence stretched on, and Morgan could feel the tension building in the room like electricity before a storm. Some people were leaning forward in their pews, desperate to hear what this legendary voice would say about the divine. Others were looking down at their hands, perhaps afraid that his answer might shatter what little faith they had left. A few teenagers in the back were recording with their phones, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. What made this moment even more powerful was that Morgan Freeman himself had been struggling with these very questions. Despite playing God in movies and narrating countless documentaries about the mysteries of existence, he had never felt more uncertain about faith than he did in recent years. The loss of friends, the challenges of aging, the state of the world, all of it had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about purpose and meaning. And now this little girl, with her innocent curiosity and fearless heart, had just asked him to bare his soul in front of 300 strangers in a house of worship. Could he be honest about his own doubts? Could he give her an answer that would strengthen rather than destroy her emerging faith? The congregation was waiting, the little girl was waiting, and somewhere in that moment of profound silence, Morgan realized that his response would either heal this community or leave them more broken than before. Pastor Williams, standing nearby, could feel his own heart pounding. He had invited Morgan Freeman hoping to inspire his struggling congregation, but now he wondered if this moment would save his church or be the final blow that scattered his flock forever. Because if Morgan Freeman, the voice that had guided them through countless stories of wonder and meaning, couldn't answer a child's simple question about God, what hope did any of them have? The tension in that church was so thick you could cut it with a knife. If you're feeling the weight of this moment, smash that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will either restore your faith or challenge everything you thought you knew about finding God. Comment below, what would you have said to that little girl? Because Morgan's answer is about to change everything. That's a beautiful question, sweetheart, Morgan said slowly, his distinctive voice carrying through the silent church like warm honey. You know, people have been asking that same question for thousands of years, and I think that makes you very wise for someone so young. He paused, looking out at the congregation, seeing nods of approval from parents who were relieved he was taking their child's question seriously. But what he said next would begin to unravel everything they thought they knew about finding the divine. Many people believe God lives in heaven, Morgan continued, his voice gentle but thoughtful. Others say he's in nature, in the mountains, the oceans, the stars we see at night. Some find him in churches like this one, in prayer, in the pages of holy books. The little girl nodded politely, but her expression remained unchanged. She had heard all of these answers before in Sunday school, and they still didn't satisfy the deep longing in her heart. But you're still not seeing him, are you? Morgan asked, crouching down slightly to meet her at eye level. The little girl shook her head, and Morgan could see a flicker of sadness in her eyes that no child should carry. That's when something shifted in the atmosphere of the church. Parents began to shift uncomfortably in their seats because they recognized that same sadness in their own hearts. Teenagers stopped scrolling on their phones because suddenly this conversation felt more real than anything they'd experienced on social media. The truth is, Morgan said, standing back up and addressing not just the little girl but the entire congregation, I think a lot of us feel that way sometimes. We're told God is everywhere, but we look around and we see pain, we see suffering, we see people struggling, and we wonder, if God is really here, why does it feel like he's so far away? A woman in the third row wiped her eyes because Morgan had just put words to the feeling she'd carried for months after losing her job. Morgan walked a few steps closer to the congregation, his presence filling the space between the pulpit and the pews. You know what's interesting about your question? He said, looking back at the little girl. You're not asking if God exists. You're asking where he is. That tells me you believe he's real, you just can't figure out why he feels so hidden. The little girl's eyes lit up slightly. Finally, someone understood what she was really asking. But here's where it gets interesting, Morgan continued, and the entire church seemed to lean in as one. Maybe the reason we can't see God isn't because he's hiding from us. Maybe it's because we're looking in all the wrong places. Maybe we've been so focused on looking up for God that we forgot to look around for him. The silence in the church was different now. It wasn't empty, it was expectant, like the moment before a revelation. An elderly man in the back row found himself thinking about his grandson who had called him that morning just to say hello. A mother remembered the stranger who had helped her carry groceries to her car the day before. A teenager recalled the moment his best friend had listened to him cry without judgment. Something was stirring in that church, something that felt like the beginning of an answer, but also like the start of an even bigger question. Morgan looked back at the little girl, who was now completely absorbed in his words. "But what I'm about to tell you," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the church, "might change how you see everything around you. Because the place where God has been hiding might be the last place any of us thought to look." Are you starting to see where this is going? If Morgan Freeman just gave you chills, hit that like button and subscribe because his next revelation is going to completely transform how this little girl, and everyone in that church, understands the divine. Comment below, where do you think God has been hiding? Because what Morgan reveals next will blow your mind. But if God is everywhere like everyone says, the little girl pressed on, her voice growing stronger with each word, then why does it hurt so much when I pray? Why does it feel like I'm talking to an empty room? Her question hit the congregation like a lightning bolt. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. This was pain. Raw, honest, heartbreaking pain that every person in that church had felt but never dared to voice out loud. Morgan felt something stir deep in his chest. This innocent question had just cracked open the very heart of human suffering, the question that kept people awake at night wondering if their faith meant anything at all. He looked around the church and saw faces that suddenly looked vulnerable, exposed, as if this child had just spoken their deepest secret. A man in the fourth row closed his eyes, remembering all the prayers he'd whispered during his wife's cancer treatment that seemed to disappear into nothing. A teenage girl thought about all the nights she'd begged God to help her feel less alone at school. "You know what, sweetheart?" Morgan said, his voice taking on a different tone, more personal, more honest than before. "I think you just asked the question that every single person in this church has wondered about at some point." He turned to face the congregation fully now. How many of you have ever felt like your prayers were just words floating up to an empty ceiling? To everyone's surprise, hands slowly began to rise throughout the church. First one, then another, then dozens, until nearly the entire congregation had their hands in the air. The little girl's eyes widened as she saw all those hands. She thought she was the only one who felt that way. She thought there was something wrong with her faith, something broken in her heart that made it hard to connect with God. But seeing all those adults, all those people she thought had perfect faith, admitting they felt the same way, it changed something in her instantly. "But here's what I've learned," Morgan continued, and his voice now carried the weight of decades of searching, of questioning, of wrestling with the same doubts that filled that church. "Maybe the problem isn't that God isn't listening. Maybe the problem is that we've been taught to expect God to show up in ways that make sense to us. We want burning bushes, we want thunderous voices, we want miracles that look like the movies. But what if God has been answering our prayers all along, just not in the language we expected?" A woman in the front row felt her breath catch. She suddenly remembered how her prayer for strength during her divorce had been answered not through a miracle, but through her neighbor who brought dinner every Tuesday for 3 months without being asked. A man thought about how his prayer for guidance in his career had been answered not through a divine vision, but through a chance conversation with a stranger at a coffee shop that led to the job of his dreams. Morgan knelt down in front of the little girl again, his eyes level with hers. "Let me ask you something," he said softly. "When you pray for help with your homework and your big sister sits down to help you even though she's tired from her own work, what do you think that is? When you pray for comfort during a storm, and your mom comes to sit with you in your room until you're not scared anymore, what do you call that?" The little girl's mouth opened slightly as understanding began to dawn in her eyes. The church was so quiet you could hear hearts beating. People were starting to see their own lives differently, starting to recognize patterns they had never noticed before. The answers to their prayers hadn't been absent. They had been coming through human hands, human hearts, human presence all along. "But you want to know the real secret?" Morgan said, standing up again and looking out at the congregation with eyes that seemed to hold infinite wisdom. "The reason you can't see God isn't because he's far away. It's because he's so close that you've been looking right through him your entire life. And what I'm about to tell you will change how you see every person you meet, every act of kindness you witness, and every moment of love you experience. The goosebumps are real right now, aren't they? If you're feeling the power of this revelation building, smash that like button and subscribe because Morgan Freeman is about to reveal something so profound that grown adults started crying right there in their pews. Comment below. Have you ever realized that your prayers were being answered in ways you didn't recognize? Because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about divine presence. Morgan looked directly into the little girl's eyes, then slowly turned to face the entire congregation. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of a revelation that would echo in their hearts for the rest of their lives. "You want to know where God is?" he said, his words deliberate and powerful. "God is in your mother's hands when she wipes away your tears. God is in your father's voice when he tells you he's proud of you. God is in your friend's hug when you're feeling alone. God isn't hiding from you, sweetheart. God has been showing up as every person who has ever loved you, helped you, or chosen kindness when they could have chosen cruelty." The silence that followed was profound, but it wasn't empty. It was full of recognition, full of understanding, full of a truth so simple and yet so revolutionary that it took their breath away. The little girl's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of wonder, of finally understanding something that had been right in front of her all along. But Morgan wasn't finished. He walked down from the pulpit area and into the congregation itself, his presence somehow making the sacred space feel even more holy. "Every time someone chooses love over fear," he continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the church, "that's God working through them. Every time a stranger helps another stranger, that's God's hands at work. Every time someone forgives instead of holding a grudge, feeds the hungry instead of walking past, listens instead of judging, that's not just human goodness. That's the divine expressing itself through human hearts." A woman in the third row began to cry as she remembered her teenage son, who had hugged her that morning after they'd had an argument the night before. She had thought it was just her son being mature, but now she saw it differently. An elderly man thought about his neighbor who shoveled his driveway every winter without being asked, and suddenly understood that those weren't just acts of kindness, they were glimpses of the sacred in ordinary moments. Morgan turned back to the little girl, who was now standing on the pew, her whole body trembling with excitement and understanding. "So when you ask where God is," he said softly, kneeling down again to meet her eyes, "the answer is that God is everywhere people choose love. God is in this church not because of the building or the cross or the stained glass windows, beautiful as they are. God is in this church because 300 people chose to gather together, to sing together, to pray together, to care about each other's hearts and souls." The little girl looked around the church with new eyes, seeing not just people sitting in pews, but seeing God reflected in every face, in every gentle smile, in every person who had listened patiently to her questions without making her feel foolish. And then she did something that no one expected. She climbed down from the pew and walked over to an elderly woman sitting alone in the row behind her, a woman everyone knew had lost her husband just 6 months earlier. The little girl took the woman's weathered hand in her small ones and said, "God is in you too, isn't he?" The elderly woman broke down completely, tears streaming down her face as she pulled the little girl into her arms. But they weren't tears of grief this time. They were tears of recognition, of feeling seen and loved and reminded that she wasn't alone in her sorrow. The whole church watched as this simple act of connection rippled through the sanctuary like waves. That's when something extraordinary happened. People began reaching out to each other, literally. Hands were extended across pews, strangers embraced, teenagers hugged their parents without embarrassment. The rigid rows of the traditional church service dissolved into a web of human connection, and in that moment, everyone could feel it, the presence they had been searching for, the divine they had been seeking, manifesting itself through their love for one another. Morgan stood in the center of it all, tears streaming down his own face as he witnessed the transformation of an entire community. The little girl had asked where God was, and in that moment, surrounded by 300 people loving each other with unprecedented openness, the answer was everywhere. This is the moment that changed everything. If you have chills running down your spine right now, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened next turned this small church service into a movement that spread far beyond those walls. Comment below, when was the last time you recognized God working through someone's kindness? Because this story is about to reach its most powerful conclusion. What happened next surprised everyone, including Morgan Freeman himself. The silence that had filled the church moments before gave way to something unprecedented in the history of St. Mary's Community Church. Instead of the usual polite handshakes and quiet small talk that followed Sunday services, people began sharing their stories, real, vulnerable, life-changing stories about moments when they had experienced the divine through human connection without even realizing it. A father stood up and tearfully shared how his teenage daughter had forgiven him after years of being absent due to his work, calling it the moment he felt closest to God in his entire life. A young mother talked about the stranger in the grocery store who paid for her groceries when her card was declined, saying she now understood that wasn't just kindness, it was a sacred encounter. One by one, people began recognizing the miraculous in their ordinary experiences, and the church transformed from a place of quiet contemplation into a sanctuary of revelation. Pastor Williams, who had been worried that Morgan's unconventional answer might scandalize his traditional congregation, watched in amazement as his community opened up in ways he had never seen before. People who had been attending church together for decades were learning things about each other's hearts that they had never shared. The rigid formality that often characterized their services melted away, replaced by something much more powerful, authentic human connection infused with spiritual understanding. But the real miracle was what happened in the days that followed. Word spread throughout the small Mississippi town about what had occurred at St. Mary's that Sunday evening. Not because people were gossiping or sensationalizing, but because the members of the congregation couldn't help but see the world differently now. They began recognizing God's presence in their daily lives. In the barista who remembered their coffee order, in the bus driver who waited an extra moment for someone running to catch the bus, in the coworker who listened without judgment during a difficult time. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow who had been embraced by the little girl, started a weekly gathering called God Sightings, where church members would share moments from their week when they had witnessed or experienced divine love through human actions. What started as a small group of 5 people grew to over 50 within a month. And then people from other churches began asking if they could attend. The little girl's question hadn't just changed one evening service. It had sparked a movement of awareness that was spreading throughout the entire community. The teenage members of the congregation, who had initially been skeptical about the whole experience, found themselves becoming the most passionate advocates for this new understanding. They started recognizing God in their classmates who stood up to bullies, in teachers who stayed after school to help struggling students, in friends who checked in during difficult times. Social media, which had been filled with complaints and negativity, suddenly became a platform for sharing stories of unexpected kindness and divine encounters in everyday life. Even more remarkably, the church's outreach programs exploded with volunteers. When people understood that serving others wasn't just charity work but actually participating in God's presence on earth, everything changed. The food bank that had struggled to find helpers was suddenly overflowing with people eager to be part of something sacred. The homeless shelter, the youth programs, the elderly care initiatives, all of them experienced unprecedented growth because people finally understood that this was where they could both find and be God's presence in the world. Morgan Freeman, who had planned to visit for just one evening, found himself returning to St. Mary's several times over the following months. Not because they asked him to, but because he was witnessing something extraordinary, a community that had discovered how to see the sacred in the ordinary, how to recognize the divine in the human, how to find God not by looking up but by looking around at each other with eyes of love. The ripple effects were incredible, weren't they? If this transformation is giving you hope for your own community, smash that like button and subscribe, because the final section reveals how this little girl's question changed not just a church, but an entire town and beyond. Comment below. How would your community change if everyone started recognizing God in acts of human kindness? Because this story's lasting impact will inspire you to see your own life completely differently. 2 years later, that little girl's question was still echoing far beyond the walls of St. Mary's Community Church. What started as one child's innocent curiosity had grown into something that newspapers called the Mississippi Miracle, a movement of divine recognition that had spread to over 300 churches across 17 states. The video of that evening, recorded on someone's phone and shared with permission from the church, had been viewed millions of times by people searching for meaning in their own lives. But the real miracle wasn't in the numbers or the media attention. It was in the transformed lives of ordinary people who had learned to see the extraordinary in everyday moments. Sarah, the little girl who had asked the question, was now 9 years old and had become something of a local legend. But she remained humble, often saying in interviews that she didn't do anything special, she just asked what everyone was already wondering. Her simple curiosity had given permission for an entire generation to question, to seek, and to find the sacred in places they never thought to look. Morgan Freeman, reflecting on that evening in later interviews, would say it was the most important performance of his life, except it wasn't a performance at all. It was the moment he stopped narrating other people's stories and started living his own truth. He established the Divine Recognition Foundation, dedicated to helping communities discover the sacred in service to one another. The foundation's motto, inspired by Sarah's question, became "God is where love shows up," and it funded programs that connected people across racial, economic, and religious divides through acts of practical kindness. St. Mary's Church, once struggling with declining attendance and wavering faith, had become a pilgrimage destination for people seeking authentic spiritual experience. But Pastor Williams was careful to remind visitors that they weren't coming to see a building or hear a sermon, they were coming to learn how to recognize what was already present in their own communities. The church's God Sightings program had been replicated in thousands of communities worldwide, creating a global network of people trained to see divine presence in human connection. The impact reached far beyond religious communities. Schools reported decreased bullying as students learned to recognize the sacred in treating each other with kindness. Hospitals found that patient care improved dramatically when staff understood their work as participating in divine healing. Business leaders credited the movement with transforming workplace cultures, as employees began seeing their colleagues not just as co-workers but as opportunities to express and experience the sacred through mutual support and respect. Even mental health professionals began incorporating divine recognition therapy into their practice, helping patients struggling with depression and anxiety to identify moments of transcendence in their daily relationships. The simple shift from seeking God in dramatic miracles to recognizing God in human kindness had profound psychological benefits, giving people a sense of purpose and connection that traditional therapy alone couldn't provide. Sarah, now a confident young speaker, would often end her presentations by returning to her original question. "I used to ask where God was," she would say, "but now I know the better question is, where isn't God?" Because once you learn to see love as the language God speaks, you realize that conversation is happening everywhere, all the time. You just have to pay attention. The little girl who had once felt like her prayers disappeared into empty air now understood that every prayer for comfort had been answered through human embrace, every prayer for guidance had been answered through wise counsel from caring people, every prayer for hope had been answered through the countless small acts of kindness that surrounded her daily. She hadn't learned to see God, she had learned to recognize that she had been seeing God all along. For Morgan Freeman, that evening in Mississippi became the defining moment of his later years. The man who had spent decades bringing stories to life with his voice had discovered that the most powerful story wasn't one he narrated, but one he lived, the story of a community that learned to see the face of the divine in every face they encountered, to hear the voice of God in every word of encouragement, to feel the presence of the sacred in every gesture of love. And to this day, whenever someone asks Sarah what changed that night in the church, she smiles and says the same thing Morgan Freeman told her: "Nothing changed except the way we learned to see. God was always there, we just finally opened our eyes." This is the story that proves that the most profound questions often come from the most innocent hearts, and the most powerful answers are found not in distant heavens but in the love we show each other every single day. If this story has opened your eyes to see God in a new way, hit that like button, subscribe for more life-changing stories, and share this video with someone who needs to remember that they are not alone, they are surrounded by the sacred every moment of every day. Comment below and tell us about a time when you recognized the divine in human kindness. Because Sarah's question might have started in one small church, but the answer belongs to all of us.